Hello and welcome to a video which as usual is going to help you get the very top grades. This is actually a feedback lesson for the students that I teach. So at my school the students take an exam practice every Wednesday and then we mark it overnight and then give them feedback that they then have to learn from as a class. You too can learn from my class's feedback. The question we are going to be looking at is from one of the AQA past questions about a poem called To a Daughter Leaving Home. And the question is, how does the poet present the speaker's feelings about her daughter? So the first thing you need to notice is what the most important word in the question is, and that is the word present. It's the word present that forces you to write about methods. And there are going to be lots of methods that you'll see. They'll be usefully highlighted in yellow so you can get a feel for what methods are. Now, before we read the first response, which was a middle mark for my group, there are 5 things that I'm going to get you to focus on. Your job is to go through these 5 as we go through and think, which of those do I think I don't do? Write any down that you think you don't do. If you do think you do them, hold fire. Then when you see the essay in a minute, it'll come up here. You will be able to decide if you were right. And then at the end of that essay, I'll give you some tasks to do based on what you see here. So there are 5 skills that I want to show you that a middle answer has. First, it starts with a thesis statement that explains what the essay is about. Secondly, it uses embedded quotations. You'll know what an embedded quotation is because it makes sense inside the sentence. You'll see that. The answer is constantly referring to the question, which is about how the poet presents the speaker's feelings. So this idea of feelings will keep recurring in the answer, so it's always relevant. The answer will also keep coming back to what the poet's method is, because that's how they present ideas, even if the way that method is explained is sometimes a bit clumsy. And then finally, this student writes about the beginning and middle and end of the poem. And that's the easiest way to write a complete answer that the examiner will think is a good one. Okay, so pause the screen and write down any of these if you think you don't do them. Right, now let's get in to the good answer. Thesis statement right here. This poem shows the reality of how hard it is for a parent to watch their children grow up and leave home. So that tells the examiner that the student understands the poem and the person in it, the speaker, which is a parent. Very easy thesis statement. She now starts with the beginning of the poem because she knows this is the chronological way she's going to go through it, some from the beginning, some from the middle, some from the end. At the start of the poem, she uses emotive language to emphasize the fact that she really doesn't want her daughter to leave home, also bringing up childhood memories when I taught you at 8 to ride a bicycle. So emotive language is subject terminology, which will be relevant to any poetry essay you ever write, and the method is using the emotive language to emphasize something. So straight away, started with a method, going to start building marks. This balances out how she used to help her daughter to do basic childhood activities. The word when reinforces the fact that it is in the past tense and that she will never experience that feeling again because her daughter is now grown up and doesn't rely on her for help. So reinforces is another method that the poet is using. Notice how the quotations just fit into the sentence. This one is much easier to fit in because it's shorter than the longer one here, but even with the longer one, she was able to fit it into the sentence, so it made sense in the sentence. In the middle of the poet uses language to make the mum sound protective. Yellow, that's the method. Notice how she's now going on about the middle of the poem, working her way through the structure. Like any parent would be of their child, I kept waiting for the thud of your crash as I sprinted to catch up. An embedded quotation even though it's a really long one. This quote contains multiple different lines that instantly make the reader aware that she is so nervous yet so protective over her daughter. I kept waiting shows that the mum was constantly on guard in case the daughter fell off her bike. Again, notice how the shorter quotation is easier to integrate, to embed into your sentence. Now up here, I wonder if you can spot a method that I didn't spot the first time I read through this. So the multiple different lines make the reader aware of something, and that has to be a method, doesn't it? Because it's controlling the reader. So we have another method. The subject terminology is actually always writing about that word, the reader, and that will always get you higher marks. At the end of the poem, notice how she's now making sure she's got the ending in as well. It ends on like a handkerchief waving goodbye. This indicates that it's finally come to the time where she is leaving home. However, prior to this quote, the mum describes the daughter to be pumping, screaming with laughter. This could resemble how excited the daughter is to leave home and start afresh, even though it's causing a lot of upset to the parent. So again, we have a method here. We've also got the use of however to introduce a different point of view. And we've got that embedded quotation again. Now, we'll briefly jump over to the mark scheme. The examiner is confident that there's clear understanding going on here. No problem with that whatsoever. For the next mark up, you have to be thoughtful and developed. And I've simply decided that it's not long enough to be considered a developed answer. So if we move across to see what the other requirements are, the word detailed keeps popping up, and this isn't detailed. There it is again. And there isn't really an analysis of the structure or the form. So those two reasons have kept it in the band below, which was about being clear. Okay, it's now time to get your green pens out again, because I'm going to show you a much better answer. And there are 4 things that I want you to pick up. If any of these do not apply to you, write them down as things you're going to pick out. Okay, so write these down as we go through. So I'm going to ask you to notice how this student keeps writing, and that means they simply make many more points, and that helps them get many more marks. Remember that word detailed in the mark scheme, and this is the simplest way to do it. Just write more. This answer will also use much more subject terminology, which you will see, and in particular, much of the terminology is about the structure of the poem. And so if you choose this particular terminology, it will force you to write about the structure, which, as you saw, brings you higher up the mark scheme. So let's have a look and see what this essay is like. You might need to pause the video here to write down the things you're going to focus on. Okay, we still start with a thesis statement where she puts her point of view. In the poem To a Daughter Leaving Home, the speaker presents the feelings about her daughter as nostalgic and reminiscent. It's not the best thesis statement, by the way, but it does at least show the examiner that this candidate is clear about what she's writing. The poem begins with the persona remembering when they taught their daughter at 8 to ride a bicycle. I'm not going to tell you what the square brackets are for. You're going to work that out as we go through the essay. Persona is terminology, yellow is a method. So, which is common experience in many childhoods. This allows the reader to feel empathetic towards the persona. So that's another method. And the persona's daughter due to the similar upbringing and memories. Pastan uses the memory of teaching the daughter to ride a bicycle to show the personal bond between the two. So there's another method. But how the closeness and bond is in the past, like a distant memory. The use of the bicycle is symbolic, a metaphor for life's journey. So there's another method, and these 2 words, symbolic and metaphor, are subject terminology because you can use them to write about every single poem you ever study. So it's also symbolic of how we are initially dependent on our mothers and fathers, but as we grow, we are less reliant on them, and the bond becomes more distant, causing the parents to reminisce about when the children were close and reliant on them. Pastan also portrays the speaker to feel sadness due to the daughter growing up. Yellow is the method, bold is the subject terminology. The persona is seen waiting for the thud, integrated quotation there, of their daughter to crash and need their help. This conveys how the speakers feel sadness. There's subject terminology that you will use in every literature essay. Because they are waiting to be an important role in their daughter's life, where she is still somewhat relying on them, despite her growing up and becoming more independent. The hyperbole of sprinting to catch up externalizes how the speaker believes. So that's the method, that's the subject terminology. It means over-exaggeration. Their daughter is growing up too fast and lampoons how quickly she's growing up. The verb sprinted implies the speed at which the daughter is. We'll wait to see that. Subject terminology there as well. The daughter is growing up requires the persona to rapidly increase in speed to allow them to keep up with the daughter's pace, to symbolize the struggle the persona has. That's another method. There's the terminology. To maintain and sustain her place in her daughter's life. Pastan also uses enjambment to reinforce the idea of a bike ride, spot the method and the terminology, and how the daughter keeps riding and doesn't stop. This is used to symbolize how life is ongoing and doesn't stop or slow down, and so, if the persona doesn't keep running, they'll get left behind. By doing this, Pastan effectively causes the reader to feel sympathy for the speaker's sadness and struggle to maintain significance in their daughter's life. Notice that sympathy is subject terminology because you will always be able to use that word when writing about any literary text. Okay, there is a conclusion which I'm just going to leave here. I'm not going to read it through because you can now see how you use these skills, in particular how you write about methods and how you can use the subject terminology. Hopefully you've also spotted how the quotations are short and fit into the sentence. Perhaps you've worked out what the square brackets are for. This is when you insert a word that is not in the quotation, but you have to make the quotation fit your sentence. So I think in the poem that word is your, but that wouldn't work. She is pumping not for your life, she's pumping for her life. So the square brackets show you have inserted a word that is not in the real quotation in order to make it make sense. Okay, let's find out what you have learnt from this. So you're now going to spend 3 to 4 minutes doing this first activity. You're going to write about one of the quotations from the poem using 1 to 3 of the skills you noticed that you were missing. Now obviously my students have got the poem in front of them. If you're a guest on my channel, you're just going to pick any unseen poem that you can do this for. So pause the video, put the timer on, 3 to 4 minutes. Okay, welcome back. Now the same time limit, 3 to 4 minutes, but I want you to write about the ending of the poem. Now the reason for that is whenever you write about the ending of the poem, you naturally write about the poet's point of view. It just happens, and writing about the poet's point of view pushes you right up the top of the mark scheme. So pick 1 to 3 skills that you were missing, can be the same ones you used here, and practice writing about the end of the poem. Now there is a vital skill that we haven't rehearsed. So here we are right at the very top of the mark scheme, and you will notice to get full marks you need to be able to write about the form and the structure of the poem. If you come down to the band below, you can get away with just writing about the structure and ignoring the form. But I want to teach you how to get 100%, so I'm going to show you part of an answer that does write about both the form and structure, then you're going to give that a go. Right, one of the reasons it's so difficult to write about form is we're not often training you to do so. So this part of the video is going to be crucial to you. Now, both the essays that we've just looked at did not write about form, and interestingly, the really good candidate that you just read had just independently, like 2 minutes before doing the exam practice, asked me about the meaning of blank verse. Now, if she'd written about blank verse, of course, she would have been writing about the form of the poem. It is written in blank verse. But she didn't think to do that because although she understood the form, it's not something that she's trained herself to do. This, by the way, is the method that I use to teach, the FOSSE way I call it. Begin by writing about form because that automatically puts you right at the top of the mark scheme as you saw. Then write about the opening. Then I have 2 lots of SOAP aims, and that just stands for any language feature that you can write about. So that, you know, we saw hyperbole, which isn't one of the techniques in SOAP aims. It doesn't matter, it's just a language feature, and this is just my way to remember it. And then finally, as I've instructed you, always write about the ending. Right, we're now going to have a look at the beginning of an answer that I wrote under time conditions while my students were writing the ones you've just looked at. The poet uses blank verse without a full stop until the very end. This method presents her feelings of joy and alarm. We imagine she remembers when I taught to be a joyful memory, so she is retelling it in a rush, and focusing on her daughter screaming with laughter also helps us hear that joy reflected in the child. However, we also get the sense of alarm that she is going too fast, which is mimicked by the pace of the poem having no end-stopped lines. We can also see this mixture of joy and alarm in the juxtaposition of screaming with laughter. Now let's look at that again. In yellow, I've got the methods that the poet is using. She's using blank verse, she's retelling an incident in a rush, she's making sure that helps us hear something, she is mimicking the pace of the poem, and she is not using end-stop lines in order to do that mimicking. Now we also have, in bold, the subject terminology, blank verse, but you might be surprised that full stop is subject terminology. Well, of course it is, because you will always be able to write about the use of full stops in a poem, especially if there are no full stops at the end of lines, and that's called end-stopped. And you'll also be able to write about juxtaposition, which means contrast here. Okay, now, blank verse is the form of the poem. End-stop lines, or lack of them, is how the poem is structured, and juxtaposition or contrast is also the structure of the poem. So immediately in my first paragraph, by banging on about the form, banging on about the structure, I've forced the examiner to try to give me top marks. The other way I've done that is in green. I've deliberately used the word method when I write about the word presents. Now that's super important in this essay, because the question will always be, every single year, how the poet presents. So this bit in green you will always be able to use. You will steal that and it will come up 100% of the time. And the great thing about using the word method is that you saw that appears in the mark scheme. And so it again guides the examiner to give you the top marks. Use these words. Freeze the screen, make some notes about these words that you need to use yourself. If you're in my class, you're actually going to use these words in a minute to write about the poem. Right, the rest of my essay I'm going to leave as a bonus feature here so that you can study from it yourself, but I don't want this to make a massive video, so I'm going to freeze the screen so that you can learn from it. So obviously you can read that. When you read this, I want you to see how I keep writing about contrast, because that is another structural technique. Other bold words are just where I'm using subject terminology. Other terminology that refers to the structure of the poem is contrast again, then contrast, and repetition, which you will find in nearly every poem, and that's an easy way to write about structure. Enjambment is also found in every single poem, and that is also a structural feature. Remember, writing about structure puts you at the top of the mark scheme, or at least into band 5. Then here is an explanation of what I've tried to be modelling to you in my essay. And now we come to the ending of my essay, and as I come to a conclusion, I want you to notice the tentative language that I use, because this tentative language hints at more than one interpretation. So I've got however, I've got perhaps, and then perhaps again. And this then explains what I want you to learn from the ending. Right, your task to test what you have learnt so far is now to do this. Write about the form of the poem. Hopefully you remember why I'm so insistent on that. Using any or all of the words that we have here. End stopped, enjambment, caesura, which I didn't cover but you probably know, and blank verse. If you've not studied this poem, apply this to a poem that you do know from the anthology you're studying. Give yourself a pat on the back. If you've kept up with this video, you're bound to get excellent results. And coming up somewhere around here or here are the links to other videos where I go through the FOSSE way, that method that I taught you about, how to approach these poems and the comparison. Subscribe if you'd like more videos like this, and see you soon on my channel.